What if the Pope's final letter wasn't read at a funeral, but found by a woman no one ever noticed? No title, no authority, just quiet hands, and a message so powerful it could shake 2,000 years of tradition. She opened it alone, and what she read changed everything. If this story already moved something in you, leave a like. It helps this message reach others who still believe in truth, dignity, and unseen heroes. And if you believe stories like this deserve to live, subscribe to this channel, not for content, but for conscience. Where are you watching this video from? We love hearing from you and always read every message. The fog hung low over Rome like a silent prophecy, thick and grey, swallowing the Vatican's marble edges in a ghostly veil. Fernanda stood at the edge of St. Peter's Square, her breath visible in the morning chill. She had walked these grounds for 17 years, unnoticed like the stones beneath her shoes. But today something was different. The air tasted of sorrow and secrets. Even the bells, usually full of purpose, echoed with hesitation. Her footsteps echoed through the polished corridors of the Apostolic Palace, muffled only by the hush of an unseen tension. No one greeted her. No cardinals bustled past with folders clutched to their chests. It was as if the Vatican itself had paused in prayer. Fernanda felt it deep in her bones. Something had ended, or begun. Her hand brushed against the ancient stone wall, grounding her to the moment. Her eyes flicked toward the private quarters of Pope Francis, where the fog outside seemed to press harder against the glass. Years of silent labor had taught her to blend into the background. As one of the cleaning staff, she knew which doors to avoid and which floors creaked. Yet today, her steps carried her forward like they had a purpose not her own. As she approached the Pope's room, her heart beat strangely, not fast, but heavy, like it knew a truth her mind had yet to grasp. The doorknob was unusually cold, sending a shiver up her spine. Inside, the quarters were still and pristine, untouched since last night, and yet the scent of incense lingered, as if clinging to a spirit that hadn't fully left. Fernanda didn't speak. She simply inhaled, closed the door gently behind her, and began her usual routine. Dust, fold, wipe, tasks that normally soothed her. But not today. Outside, the city stirred to life. But within the Vatican walls time had warped. Fernanda paused by the Pope's writing desk, her eyes drawn to the faint indentation of where his hand used to rest. There was something there, just under a paperweight shaped like a dove, something that hadn't been there before, or maybe had, waiting for the right moment. Her fingers hovered over it, then hesitated. She looked around, still alone. The fog beyond the window thickened like a curtain drawn for a final act. She picked up the object, a folded letter, sealed with wax bearing the papal crest. Not official Vatican protocol, but something far more personal. Her throat tightened. What was she doing? She wasn't meant to see this. She wasn't anyone. And yet, in that moment, the silence of the room whispered back, "But what if you are?" Fernanda had always believed that popes were distant figures, sacred, yes, but untouchable, like marble statues wrapped in gold. Pope Francis had been no different to her. He walked past her once in a corridor, nodded with kindness, but said nothing. She never expected more. And yet, as she moved about his private quarters now, she felt something strange, an emotional warmth, a quiet weight, as if his presence still lingered in the air like perfume on a loved one's sweater. She stopped by the edge of his bed, untouched, perfectly made. On the nightstand, his glasses rested neatly folded beside a Bible worn at the spine. A sense of reverence held her in place. She remembered the stories, how he had spoken of mercy, of simplicity, of lifting up the unseen. For years she thought those messages were for others, cardinals, bishops, the world. But now, in this eerie quiet, it felt like they had always been meant for someone like her. The Vatican walls had always made Fernanda feel small, invisible. She had scrubbed floors while theologians debated salvation. Yet now, standing alone in his space, she felt seen for the first time. The fog outside hadn't lifted, but something within her had. She placed her hand on the arm of the Pope's favorite chair, leather worn smooth from reflection, and closed her eyes. For a moment it felt like someone was watching her. Not with judgment, but with trust. A whisper of wind slid in through the cracked window. The curtains fluttered slightly, like the breath of a departing soul. Fernanda shivered but didn't move away. Instead, she looked at the small wooden crucifix on the wall, the one Pope Francis had requested from his childhood church in Buenos Aires. The eyes of Christ carved into the wood seemed gentler than she remembered, like they knew a secret, like they were inviting her in. She tried to shake the feeling, told herself she was just tired, that her emotions were playing tricks, but even as she returned to dusting the shelves, her mind stayed locked on the sensation. Something about today felt different, sacred almost. As if the room itself was waiting for her to find something, not just clean it. And then it hit her, not a sound, not a vision, just a sudden inner pull, like gravity, but not from the earth, from within. Something in this room was meant for her. She didn't know what, she didn't know why, but she knew she wouldn't leave until she found it. Her hands moved by habit, dusting frames, adjusting curtains, aligning books. But her eyes wandered constantly to the desk. It wasn't grand, just a humble wooden surface with a simple lamp and a few scattered pages. Nothing about it screamed importance. And yet her instincts kept tugging. Something was there, something that didn't belong, or maybe it did, and was waiting to be found. She leaned in, brushing a cloth gently over the edge of the desk. That's when she saw it, a folded piece of cream-colored paper tucked just beneath the Pope's rosary beads. The letter was sealed with a red wax crest, not the official seal of the Vatican, but a more intimate mark bearing his personal ring insignia. Her heart skipped. This wasn't protocol, this was private. She stared at it for a long moment. No one was around. No footsteps in the hallway, no whispers of approaching clergy. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, and for a second she stopped, half expecting someone to call out and stop her. But nothing came, only silence. She picked it up carefully, like lifting a sacred relic. It felt warm in her hands, as if holding a heartbeat. She turned the letter over. On the back, written in the Pope's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words, "For the one who stays." Her lips parted. That phrase, it didn't sound official, it sounded personal, chosen. Like he had written it knowing she would be the one to find it, like he wanted her to. The moment stretched, heavy and surreal. She sat down slowly in his chair, her apron brushing the leather seat that once held the weight of a world leader. Then, with hands that could barely hold steady, she broke the seal. The wax cracked softly. She unfolded the letter like peeling away the edge of a secret the world had ignored for too long. Her eyes scanned the first line, and then the second, and then her breath caught. This wasn't just a farewell. It wasn't a prayer or a blessing. It was a declaration, a final message that could shake the foundation of everything around her. Her mouth went dry. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The Holy Father had left behind something more than memories. He had left a truth no one was ready for. Fernanda's eyes devoured the words on the page, each line heavier than the last. The Pope had known. He had felt death approaching, not in fear but with clarity. His handwriting, though slower than usual, was deliberate, thoughtful. He spoke not as a leader above his people, but as a servant among them. And in those final paragraphs, he dropped a revelation so radical, it nearly made her drop the paper from her hands. He wrote of a dream, not a political vision, but a spiritual conviction, that the Church, in all its splendor and structure, had forgotten something essential, the maternal spirit. He believed that the future of the faith required not just more mercy, but a leader capable of embodying it. One day, the letter said, the shepherd must carry a mother's voice. A voice that heals, not commands. Fernanda's eyes welled with tears. He described a future where a woman, not just a nun, not just a servant, could wear the white robe, not as a symbol of rebellion, but of restoration. The Church, he wrote, was born of a woman's yes. It must not fear hearing one again. The phrase echoed in her mind like the toll of a sacred bell. It was blasphemy to some, hope to others. To her it was thunderous. Fernanda clutched the letter tighter, hands shaking. This wasn't just a secret. It was a spiritual grenade, a challenge to a 1,000-year-old hierarchy. Why had he written it? Why not deliver it to the cardinals, to the world? And more importantly, why leave it for her, she who had no title, no voice, no seat at the table? Was that the point? That truth was safest in the hands of the overlooked? Suddenly the quiet of the room became oppressive. The weight of the message settled over her shoulders. Her chest tightened. She wanted to hide it, protect it. But from what? Or who? She looked toward the door, half expecting it to swing open. The silence that once felt peaceful now felt dangerous. The Vatican wasn't a building. It was a system, a living, breathing organism with defenses, and she had just found its deepest vulnerability. The letter trembled in Fernanda's grasp, the paper soft and warm from her hands. She pressed it to her chest, as if trying to absorb its meaning, to anchor its gravity into her soul. Her breath came in shallow waves. This wasn't just about religion. This was about power, history, and a message that could unravel everything she had been told was untouchable. And now somehow it lived in her hands. A part of her wanted to run, to tear it apart and forget she ever saw it. But another part, deeper and louder, urged her to protect it, not just because it was sacred, but because it felt right. Pope Francis hadn't left it to the clergy. He hadn't sealed it away in a vault. He had placed it where she would find it. That meant something. It had to. Maybe he believed the truth had to pass through the humble to ever be heard. But the fear crept in quickly. What if someone saw her? What if this was a trap? Her mind raced with images of dismissal, interrogation, exile. Who was she to hold something so explosive? She was a cleaner, a shadow. And yet now she felt like the guardian of a spiritual revolution. She looked at the Pope's chair again, suddenly aware of the weight that once sat there, now transferred silently to her. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from awe. This was a moment people only read about, moments that changed tides, rewrote doctrine, redefined what was possible. Her pulse echoed in her ears. She placed the letter gently inside her apron pocket, wrapping it in a linen cloth she had folded 100 times before. It didn't feel like cloth now. It felt like armor. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Just one pair, deliberate and slow, approaching, the kind that didn't belong to another cleaner or a guard. Fernanda's stomach dropped. She turned toward the doorway, heart pounding. The rhythm of those steps sounded too rehearsed, too precise. The moment she had feared was no longer a shadow. It was here. The heavy wooden door swung inward with the slowness of a scene from a dream, and standing in the frame was Sister Lucia, tall, composed, her face a mask of cold authority. Her habit was crisp, untouched by time, and her eyes scanned the room like spotlights. Fernanda froze. The letter, still hidden in her apron, felt like it was burning against her skin. Sister Lucia's presence was not just unsettling, it was surgical. She stepped into the Pope's chamber without speaking. Her heels clicked against the floor like a metronome of judgment. "You're early," she said, her voice soft but laced with iron. Fernanda nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. Lucia's gaze didn't waver. It moved from the bed to the desk, to the exact spot where the letter had been moments ago. Her brows tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Fernanda caught it. Lucia approached the desk, her fingers brushing the spot where the rosary still lay. Her voice dropped lower, almost tender. "Did you find anything out of place this morning?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Fernanda shook her head, a simple, mechanical movement, but her hands were clenched, hidden in the folds of her apron. She could feel her heartbeat in her palms. There was something about Sister Lucia that didn't belong to the world of prayer and candles. She was a gatekeeper, not of heaven, but of secrets. Fernanda had always sensed that. The Pope's open-hearted spirit had felt out of place next to Lucia's doctrine-driven rigidity. And now it was clear. Whatever was in the letter, Lucia likely knew it existed and had every intention of burying it. She stepped closer, invading Fernanda's space with surgical precision. "The Holy Father kept strange thoughts in his final days," she murmured, as if testing the air. "Things not meant for public eyes. If anything is found, it must be returned to the Curia, immediately." Her eyes locked onto Fernanda's, not angry, not pleading, just expectant. like she already knew the answer and was daring Fernanda to lie. But Fernanda didn't flinch, not yet. She nodded slowly, the way she had been taught. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of Sister Lucia. Not truly. Because deep down she understood something the sister didn't. This letter wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to survive. The stillness between them was like glass, clear, sharp, ready to shatter with one wrong word. Fernanda stood her ground, her hands still tucked into her apron, fingers wrapped tightly around the folded letter. Sister Lucia's presence was oppressive, like cold stone pressing against the chest. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her authority came from 1,000 years of tradition, and she wielded it like a blade. Lucia moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. "The church is fragile right now," she said, almost to herself. "We must be careful with ideas." Her voice dipped on that final word. Fernanda said nothing. Her thoughts were too loud. Wasn't truth more important than control? She had scrubbed these floors while priests whispered scandals behind closed doors. And now, when the truth finally emerged in daylight, it had to be hidden. Fernanda knew that if she gave up the letter, it would vanish, locked away, denied, erased. The Pope's final hope, gone like it was never written. And yet, her entire life had trained her to obey, to stay quiet, to keep her place. She felt torn between two identities, the invisible worker the Vatican had always expected her to be, and the guardian of something divine. She was beginning to understand why he chose her. Lucia turned back toward her, eyes narrow. "If he left anything that you will tell me." It wasn't a request. It was a verdict in search of a confession. But Fernanda didn't answer. Instead, she lowered her gaze respectfully and said nothing. The silence wasn't fear. It was a form of protest, a quiet rebellion. For a moment, the air between them thickened. Then Lucia's lips curled slightly, not in a smile, but in something colder, but recognition. She knew Fernanda was hiding something, and Fernanda knew she knew. It was a standoff without weapons, but with stakes that could change the soul of the church itself. As Lucia left the room, her eyes lingered for a breath too long. A silent warning, but Fernanda didn't watch her go. She turned back to the desk, where the rosary still lay beside the empty space where the letter had been. The war hadn't started with swords or sermons. It had started with a single decision, to keep the truth alive. The Vatican, once her place of quiet routines, now felt like a labyrinth of eyes and echoing footsteps. Fernanda moved through it, with the letter tucked beneath her blouse, every sound amplified. Each whisper in the hallway, each cough from a passing priest, each door creak felt like it was meant for her. She avoided main corridors, slipping instead through narrow service paths she knew better than most. Her body moved on instinct, but her mind was racing. She ducked into the laundry room, surrounded by the warmth of steam and the soft thrum of machines. For a brief moment it felt safe, a cocoon of linens and silence. She sat behind a rack of white cassocks and pressed the letter close to her heart. The Pope's words replayed in her mind like a hymn, a mother's voice, a leader with empathy, a church reborn. She didn't know if she was meant to carry the message or simply keep it alive until someone else could. Beyond the thick laundry doors, whispers had begun to spread. The Pope's passing had stirred more than just grief. It had unearthed tension. Staff members were murmuring about loose documents, about unusual instructions. A senior Monsignor had been seen speaking urgently with Sister Lucia. The stillness of the Vatican was cracking. Something was shifting beneath its marble surface, and Fernanda could feel the fault line beneath her feet. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever, but she also couldn't let go of what she held. It was no longer just a letter. It was a living truth, and she was its vessel. If she was caught, they'd call her a liar, a thief, possibly even a heretic. But in her chest something had bloomed, not pride, not fear, purpose. She no longer moved like a servant. She moved like someone carrying fire. Later that afternoon she emerged cautiously. Her eyes scanned the corridors. Guards weren't following her, but something worse was uncertainty. Every face seemed to carry suspicion. She avoided Sister Lucia, avoided the cardinal halls, and drifted instead toward the crypts, toward quiet, toward sanctuary. It was a strange pull, but one she trusted. And as she passed through the shadowed arches of the lower basilica, she heard something that stopped her cold. A voice, small, clear, and impossibly familiar. A child, speaking just outside the Vatican Square. The words floated in through the stone. "He's not gone," the girl said. "He left a message for all of us." Fernanda's breath hitched. Those were the exact words from the Pope's letter. Fernanda pressed herself against the cool stone wall of the corridor, heart thudding like a warning bell. The voice outside was unmistakable, soft, certain, and unafraid. She edged closer to a side entrance that opened toward the square. Through the tall iron lattice, she saw a girl no older than 10 standing barefoot at the foot of a statue of St. Peter. Her clothes were simple, her hair tousled by the wind. And yet every word she spoke gripped the air like scripture. "There is a letter," the child said, "and it says, 'A woman will carry the light.'" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Tourists and pilgrims alike gathered, drawn not by spectacle but by something deeper, the sense that they were witnessing something holy. Fernanda's knees nearly gave out. These were not words a child could invent. They were from the letter. She knew it. She had just read them. The girl didn't seem lost or frightened. She stood tall, eyes wide but clear, as if looking beyond the present moment. Her voice was steady, her presence almost otherworldly, not mystical but anchored. People leaned in closer, not to question but to listen. One older woman clutched her chest and whispered a prayer. A man fell to his knees, eyes misty. The girl looked at no one in particular. She simply spoke. Fernanda watched, tears brimming. It was as if the letter had found another voice, one it had chosen separately from her, or maybe one meant to echo hers. How could this girl know what was written in a sealed letter? Had she seen it in a dream? Had the Pope spoken to her in his final hours? Or was this something else, something beyond understanding? Whatever it was, Fernanda didn't feel alone anymore. The message had already begun to breathe. She backed away from the gate slowly, heart pounding but steadier than before. The fog had lifted slightly. A few rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting gold on the basilica's ancient stone. It was subtle, but it felt like confirmation. The letter wasn't just hers to carry. The truth was moving. And the church, whether it wanted to or not, was beginning to listen. Inside the walls, the tension simmered. She knew that Sister Lucia would be watching the square soon, that someone would try to silence the girl, that the message would be called a lie, a manipulation, a threat. But Fernanda also knew this. Once truth is spoken, especially by the innocent, it becomes harder to deny, and that meant something had already changed. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories of truth breaking through silence, of dignity rising from the shadows, then this is your moment. Subscribe to this channel, not just to follow content, but to stand for something. Because if the world forgets voices like Fernanda's, we lose more than a story, we lose the truth. The basilica's lower corridors were quieter now, like the Vatican itself was holding its breath. Fernanda moved slowly, keeping close to the shadows, the letter still pressed beneath the fabric of her blouse. She didn't know where she was going exactly, only that she needed space, a moment to think, to pray, to breathe. And somehow her feet carried her toward the crypts, the place where the living honor the dead. It felt fitting. The Pope's voice was gone, but not silent. As she descended the stone steps, she heard a familiar sound, soft humming, broken occasionally by whispered prayer. She turned the corner and found Father Matteo kneeling near a candlelit alcove. He was known among the staff for his kindness, a man more interested in mercy than rules. Children gravitated toward him. The sick found peace in his presence. And now Fernanda found herself staring at him with a desperation she didn't yet understand. He looked up and met her eyes, and something passed between them. Not alarm, but recognition. "So you've seen something," he said gently, not as a question but a certainty. Fernanda hesitated, then stepped forward and reached into her apron. She unwrapped the cloth and held out the letter. Her hands shook as she offered it. Not from fear of him, but from the weight of what she was about to share. Father Matteo took it without a word. He sat on a nearby bench and began to read. His eyes scanned each line slowly, reverently, as though each word held sacred consequence. When he reached the final sentence, he closed the letter softly, then looked up at her with glassy eyes. "This may be the work of the Spirit," he whispered. "He left it for someone who would protect it, someone the world doesn't expect." For the first time that day, Fernanda felt her spine straighten. She was no longer a woman hiding in silence. She was a messenger, perhaps not chosen by title but chosen by trust. Matteo didn't offer strategy or command. He offered faith. "Whatever happens," he said, "this letter must live. I will help you." His voice was calm, firm, the kind of calm that could part seas. They sat in silence for a moment longer, the candles flickering around them like tiny beating hearts. And though the halls above still whispered with suspicion and control, down here, Fernanda had found something rare. Not just an ally, but a witness. And that made all the difference. The great doors of the basilica opened with a soft groan, letting in the crisp air of the Roman afternoon. Fernanda stood near the side altar with Father Matteo beside her, half hidden by a column. Visitors wandered in quietly, lighting candles, whispering prayers, or simply staring up at the stained glass windows in search of answers. And then, like a ripple across still water, the atmosphere shifted. People began turning their heads toward the entrance. There she was again, the same little girl from the square. She walked slowly down the central aisle, barefoot still, her simple dress fluttering slightly with each step. But her face was calm, her eyes wide with purpose. The basilica, usually so imposing, seemed to bend around her presence. She wasn't out of place, she was meant to be here. And in her hand she held nothing but a small white flower. She paused at the center, beneath the grand dome, and began to speak. "He said the truth doesn't need a crown, it only needs courage." Her voice was clear, stronger than before. The letter was not just for one. It was for all who still believe love can lead. Her words echoed across the marble floor, up into the arches, through the hearts of every listener. They were not random. They were exact phrases from the Pope's letter. Gasps rippled through the pews. Some looked to the clergy for explanation. Others simply wept. A nun covered her mouth with both hands. An older priest sat down abruptly, overwhelmed. And Fernanda? She watched with a trembling heart. It wasn't just about her anymore. The message was breaking free of walls. The Pope's truth was walking, in the voice of a child. Father Matteo turned to her, voice hushed. "This is no accident." He looked like a man seeing a miracle. "This girl, she is a mirror." A sign. Fernanda felt her knees weaken, but not from fear, from awe. From the realization that the message could no longer be buried. Not when a child spoke it with such clarity. Not when the basilica itself fell into reverent silence to hear it. The girl finished with a simple sentence. "You already know who the next light is." Then she placed the flower at the altar, turned, and walked back toward the doors, as if her task had been completed. No one dared stop her. No one dared speak. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing that remained. The doors hadn't even closed behind the girl when Sister Lucia reappeared, this time with 2 clerics flanking her. Her stride was sharp, her eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's precision. She spotted Fernanda almost instantly and walked directly toward her. The moment had come. Fernanda felt it in her bones. No more hiding, no more time. Her hands instinctively moved to the letter hidden beneath her apron. She could feel it pulse like a second heart. Lucia stopped just a foot away, her expression unreadable, but her intent unmistakable. "We need to talk," she said, cold and quiet. Fernanda hesitated, then followed her to a secluded alcove, Matteo trailing behind at a distance. Lucia didn't waste time. "You have it," she said. "I know you do. This is not a matter of belief anymore. This is about order." Her words snapped through the air like a lit match. "Give it to me, Fernanda, before this becomes something irreversible." For a moment, Fernanda couldn't breathe. Every lesson of obedience she had ever been taught screamed inside her. But over that noise came the Pope's voice, gentle, clear from the letter. The Church must not fear the voice of the Mother. She reached into her apron but didn't hand it over. Instead, she clutched it tighter. "You're wrong," she whispered. "This doesn't destroy order, it restores it." Her voice was shaking, but she did not look away. Lucia's eyes narrowed. "You think you're chosen?" she spat. "You think you matter more than centuries of tradition? This isn't a fairy tale, Fernanda. This is Rome. This is power." The two clerics exchanged uneasy glances, as if unsure whether to intervene. But Fernanda saw something else in them, a flicker of doubt, a hesitation. They had heard the girl's voice. They had felt the shift. "I don't think I'm chosen," Fernanda replied, her voice steadier now. "I think he chose the truth, and I'm just carrying it." For a beat, no one moved. Then, like a crack in marble, Lucia's composure faltered. Her jaw tightened. She took a step forward, but Matteo stepped between them. "Enough," he said. "You speak of order, sister. But order built on fear is not the Church he believed in." Fernanda stood firm, the letter still pressed to her chest. Her loyalty was torn, to the Church that raised her, and to the truth that had finally seen her. But in this moment, fear was no longer the louder voice. The choice wasn't easy, it was necessary, and now it had been made. Evening fell over the Vatican like a velvet curtain, and the basilica glowed from within, golden light spilling through stained glass, casting colors onto the faces of the faithful. A vigil had begun. People gathered without knowing why, as if pulled by an invisible string. Word had spread of the girl's words, of whispers about a message. Candles flickered in trembling hands. The tension hung like incense, dense, expectant. Fernanda stood just beyond the altar, the letter now clutched openly in her hand. She stepped forward slowly, heart pounding loud enough to drown the murmurs. Her apron was still dusted with ash from the laundry room, but her back was straight. For the first time in her life, all eyes were on her. No one spoke, not the priests, not the sisters, not the guards at the doors. Even Sister Lucia, seated in the front pew, remained frozen, eyes sharp but silent. Fernanda's voice broke the stillness. "I was never meant to speak," she began, her voice shaking, "but he left these words for someone like me, and now for all of us." She unfolded the letter carefully, and with each word she read, the atmosphere changed. "The Church," she read aloud, "must one day be led by a voice that knows how to weep with the broken, to nurture with mercy, and to rise with love, the voice of a mother." A gasp swept through the crowd. Some bowed their heads, others clutched their chests. As Fernanda read on, quoting the Pope's final wishes, the silence deepened. She spoke of empathy over authority, of strength in compassion, of faith that walks barefoot with the forgotten. The letter was not a rebellion, it was a roadmap, a prayer, a call for something more tender and more terrifying than doctrine, transformation. And by the time she reached the final line, her voice was no longer trembling, it was clear. He said, "Let no gate be closed to the woman who brings light." When she finished, she lowered the letter slowly, her eyes glistening but steady. The basilica held its breath. And then, someone began to clap. A single pair of hands, then another, and another. Not loud, not theatrical, but steady, honest, like rain hitting stone. The kind of applause that breaks through fear. Lucia didn't rise. She didn't speak. Her silence said everything. The power she once carried so effortlessly had become a weight too heavy. Father Matteo stepped forward, standing beside Fernanda. He didn't say much, just placed a hand on her shoulder and bowed his head. Around them, candles continued to burn. The light did not flicker, it grew. For a long moment, the basilica was suspended in silence. No one moved. No one dared disturb what had just taken place. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. Even the candles seemed to stand still, their flames tall and unmoving, as if the very air had agreed to listen. Fernanda lowered her eyes, unsure of what she had just started. But deep inside, she felt a strange peace. The storm had passed, and she had survived it. Then, slowly, Father Matteo turned to the crowd and raised the letter above his head. "Let no man "Or woman, silence this," he said firmly, his voice ringing through the arches. It wasn't a sermon. It was a declaration. And it shattered whatever hesitation still lingered in the hearts of those present. People nodded, wept, prayed. One cardinal covered his face not in shame, but in surrender. The truth had entered the room, and no doctrine could lock it away. Sister Lucia rose to her feet but did not speak. Her eyes met Fernanda's for one long moment. No accusation, no fury, just a hollow stare. The look of someone watching a world she knew begin to shift beneath her feet. She turned and walked away without a word, her footsteps quiet, her power no longer absolute. The echo of her retreat felt symbolic, like a page turning. Outside, the fog had lifted completely. A few stars now peeked through the twilight, and the Vatican Square was filled with people holding candles, some praying, others simply standing still, as if waiting for something. Fernanda stepped out slowly, the crisp night air kissing her face. She was no longer the invisible woman who swept marble floors. She had become the keeper of a message that would live long after her. A little girl, the same one, stood near the steps, watching. She smiled gently, her eyes bright with recognition. Fernanda took a breath, walked toward her, but before she could speak, the girl turned and slipped into the crowd. No goodbye, no fanfare. Just a quiet exit, like a whisper sent back to heaven. And as the basilica bells began to chime, not for ceremony but for memory, Fernanda stood at the edge of the ancient stone plaza, no longer a shadow. The Pope may have passed, but his voice through her was now louder than ever. The following days felt like walking through a city that was the same, but not. Rome didn't change overnight, but the air was different. People spoke softer in the corridors of the Vatican. Some avoided Fernanda. Others looked at her with hesitant reverence. She wasn't celebrated, but she was no longer invisible. She was something else now, a vessel that had been chosen not by rank but by faith, and that truth had ignited something no one could unsee. News of the girl and the letters spread, but not through headlines. It moved through whispers, homilies, small gatherings. In parishes across the world, priests referenced a quiet call to reimagine leadership. Nuns felt seen, women felt heard. Children asked questions no longer answered with silence. The Pope's words, once folded in secrecy, were now woven into prayer, and the people began to sense the Church had heard something it couldn't forget. Fernanda didn't seek fame. She returned to her duties, folding linens, lighting candles, sweeping stone halls, but she did them with a quiet power now. Some thanked her. Others warned her, but she carried herself not as a hero, but as someone who had looked fear in the eye and chosen truth anyway. She hadn't changed who she was. She had revealed what she had always been, faithful, brave, unseen until it mattered most. One morning she returned to the chapel and found a folded note on the bench where she had read the letter aloud. No name, no signature. Just one line. When the fire is real, it doesn't need applause, only breath. She smiled gently, tucked the note into her pocket, and lit a candle. For the Pope, for the girl, for every woman who ever wondered if heaven had heard her voice. Outside, tourists took photos of the basilica, unaware that its soul had shifted. But among them stood a few who had been there that night, who had heard Fernanda's voice tremble, then steady, then rise. They didn't look at the marble statues. They looked at each other, because they had seen something eternal break through the ritual. And though the Vatican's walls still stood tall, something had begun to burn, not in destruction, but in warmth, a new fire. One that would not consume but illuminate. And at the center of that flame stood a woman with no title, only truth. Sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that rise from silence. Fernanda didn't ask for attention. She never imagined herself standing at the altar, but when truth knocked, she answered, not with defiance, but with quiet courage. The Pope's final wish wasn't about rebellion. It was about redemption, about seeing leadership not through robes and rituals, but through empathy and strength of spirit. And maybe, just maybe, the Church isn't changing from the top down, but from the heart outward. Would you have had the courage to speak up in Fernanda's place? Tell us in the comments. We want to know what you would have done. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're building a space for stories that challenge, heal, and inspire. And don't miss our next episode, another real-life parable that might just shift the way you see the world.